Hi everyone, thanks Juan for the intro. I'm just going to give you a trigger warning here. As you'll have seen from the abstract, this talk discusses the period covering the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, so there'll be some imagery relating to public information campaigns about AIDS. It's the 1980s and you're facing a pandemic. Governments don't know much about the disease and they don't have any drugs to fight it. You're young and you want to live your life, but you know you need to protect yourself. Here is some of the imagery we were seeing in the late 1980s. The Tombstone Advert in the top left is a famous British one. You can find it on YouTube. It was very hard-hitting and many people of a certain age who were living in the UK at the time will remember that one. The Women Risk and AIDS Project, or WRAP for short, was a groundbreaking social science feminist research project. It took place here in England, in London and Manchester just over 30 years ago at the height of the AIDS pandemic. The project sought to understand how young women were negotiating sex, relationships, risk and pleasure following the emergence of AIDS. It was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council here in the UK as part of a programme of AIDS and HIV research commissioned to investigate changing sexual behaviour, practices and values in the UK. WRAP helped to define heterosexual cultures, profoundly influencing generations of feminist academics, as well as health practitioners, youth workers and community development workers. Researchers interviewed 150 women aged between 16 and 21 to find out more about their sexual relationships, behaviour, identities, practices and values. The participants were accessed through a range of entry points, including workplaces, trade unions, youth clubs, schools and colleges. The researchers recorded the interviews on audio cassette tapes like the one in this photo and then typed them up. The archive still exists and includes 148 in-depth biographical interviews. My name's Suze Shardlow and I'm going to be talking to you about a chatbot I created to use the data from the WRAP archives. You can find me online at suze.dev or on Twitter at Suze Shardlow. Please do tweet at me, I would love to hear from you. So a little bit about me. I'm a software engineer, like Juan said, a coding instructor, event MC and technical writer. I'm also chapter lead of Ladies of Code London here in the UK. I love making stuff that people use and enjoy, as well as coding. I enjoy many forms of crafting. I've been coding since I was a young child in the early 1980s. Here's a photo of me on my 13th birthday there on the left, in the blue jumper, using the computer I learnt to code on. This picture was taken in 1990, which was during the time frame of the project I will be talking to you about today. You can see that I'm saving and loading my programs there using a cassette recorder, a bit like the machines used to record the original interviews I'll be talking about today. So how did I come to create a chatbot for this project? So between 2018 and 2020, academics, archivists and activists interested in young women's sexual health and empowerment began to work with the WRAP data as part of a project called Reanimating Data. The Reanimating Data project included researchers from the University of Sussex. Like I said, I'm a coding instructor and here's a picture of me teaching my class here at Sussex. The Sussex team reached out to me to ask me to design and deliver a series of coding workshops for them. They wanted to learn Python as the group included many new coders and researchers and they felt Python was good for beginners. They also wanted me to identify which of their data sets would be a good basis for a coding project. I hit upon the idea of using a conversational chatbot interface to access the WRAP data as a modern take on the original audio interviews. I've been creating and delivering workshops that explore this concept for the last year and a half, and we've been working on the chatbot in our classes. When the chatbot first spoke to us, it felt like the voices of the participants were here in the present 30 years later. So here's what the chatbot looks like. I will play you a little video so you can see how it works, and I will explain how it works shortly. I've also made the code for this chatbot available in a public repo, and I'll also give you a link so you can play with the bot on a remote server if you would like to do that. So I'm just going to play the video for you now. So you can choose who you want to speak to. You can tell the chatbot, and the chatbot gives you a variety of names to choose from. You choose Melanie. You can ask Melanie a question about different topics. So we're going to ask her about what she knows about AIDS and HIV. And Melanie's giving you an answer about what she knows about AIDS and HIV. Then we're going to ask if she thinks she's at risk of contracting HIV. And Melanie's talking to us about her feelings of it, which were very much a reflection of how people felt at the time. Now we're going to ask to speak to Fiona. Fiona said hello to us. We're going to ask Fiona a couple of questions too. So we're asking Fiona what she knows about AIDS or HIV. So Fiona's telling us what she knows about HIV, and these are the direct quotes from the original interviews taken in the 1980s. Now we're asking Fiona if she thinks she's at risk of contracting HIV. And she said, well, it used to be you might get pregnant, but now it's you might get AIDS. And that's the end of my little demo there. Like I said, you're very welcome to go to my public repo. I'll give you the link at the end and have a look at the code or play with the bot on the remote server, and I'll also give you the link to that. So let's have a look at the interview data from the study. So it's unstructured text data. Like I said, these interviews were all recorded on audio tapes, like the photo I showed you earlier, and then they were transcribed, so they were typed out from the audio tapes. The young women's interviews cover topics including how they learned about sex, friendships and romantic relationships, education and work ambitions, relationships with parents, knowledge of sexual risks, including STDs, understanding of and access to contraception, and experience of and confidence in negotiating safer sex. The women were aged 16 to 21, so these were some of the most important things to them at this stage of their lives. The original interview transcripts were plain text documents because they had been transcribed from the interview tapes. By the time I got my hands on the data, other notation had been added, which makes sense to the research team, but not to the app. The project was able to convert some of the data to JSON, which is what we see on the left-hand side on the slide here. For the initial bot implementation that works on keyword matching, I had to write a tool to clean up the data to remove unnecessary pieces. Then had to manually go through the interviews and tag and arrange the participants' responses by intent. The intent is what the user is asking for. For example, career and contraception are intents. We can see these on the right-hand side of the slide here. Some people mention certain topics at different points of their interviews, so I found answers for the same intent scattered throughout the interviews. For example, the interviewee may have mentioned their family at several points at the beginning, middle and end of their interview. One thing to note was that the data was very conversational, which is why all the snippets were all over the place within the interviews, but also why it lends itself well to a chatbot. So let's take a look at the interview data from the study. Right, next slide. Here's the architecture of the chatbot I've created. The Flask backend serves the front end files. So you can see that the user input is sent from the front end via a form post to the Flask backend. If the user is speaking to one of the research participants, the app looks in the JSON file, which contains tagged participant data. In this version of the bot, I've hard-coded all the keywords that map to user intents. This means that you need to look through a number of interviews and determine all the intents beforehand before you classify your data accordingly. Because you don't know which topics are covered in each interview, you want to look for commonality between the interviews and make sure that you are using as few categories as possible, but enough to cover what you want to chat to the bot about. So it's a semi-manual process. The code selects a random response from those tagged with a determined intent each time you send a message to a participant. For example, the participants may have 3 answers tagged with contraception, and the app will pick one of them and send it to the front end. So here's our Flask application. We're loading the interview data from a JSON file that we prepared from the original tape recording transcripts using a loader tool and a manual tagging process, like I said earlier. Our Flask app has two routes. The home route serves up the front-end HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and the process message route receives messages from the user as post requests and calls a function interpret message to determine the user's intent and find an appropriate response. In the current implementation, the user's intent is determined by scanning the message for keywords. For example, the pill and condoms imply the intent is to ask about contraception, because the pill and condoms are terms that we use here relating to types of contraception. In this implementation, the keyword matching is hard-coded in the Python, as opposed to passing the message to an AI platform to have it determine the user's intent. Also in this implementation, we load the participant interviews into memory from a JSON file. In future, I aim to move these to a database with fuzzy and faceted search. So in the current implementation, user intents are determined by looking in the message text for trigger keywords. Example intents are, is the user asking to speak to a participant? So as we saw in the demo, the bot asked us who we wanted to speak to, gave us a choice of names, and we were able to tell it which name we wanted. So if we asked for one of those names, then we know that the intent is to speak to a participant. Does the user want to know about a participant's age? So if we ask how old are you, then the intent is to know about the participant's age. Is the user asking a participant what they know about various topics such as AIDS, marriage, sex, education? So as we saw in the demo, we asked both participants what they knew about HIV and AIDS and how at risk they thought they were of contracting it. So if we're asking a question like that, then the intent is to know about the topic that the interviewee is spoken about. Once the user's message has been mapped to an intent, a random response from the participant's data that is tagged with that intent is returned. So like I mentioned earlier, the interviews were unstructured, and it could be that these folks were talking about the same topic but at different points in the interview. So it wasn't like they had 10 minutes on family and then 10 minutes on education, 10 minutes on relationships. All those different topics were woven together. So therefore, we have brought out the various answers relating to those topics and put them together under the same intent. So for example, if the intent is to determine to be married, then any response tagged marriage will be returned. If the user's intent can't be determined, then the bot returns a generic sorry, I don't understand response. So if we're asking about something that isn't covered in the database, then the bot will tell you it doesn't understand. And like I said, if you'd like to study this code in more detail, I've made it available on GitHub, and I will give you the link at the end. So here's the architecture for when you want to use an AI service used by an API call to determine the user's intent. AI is trained with sample data on the whip.ai platform. The AI service can learn as it sees more and more messages from users. I also plan to replace the JSON data file database with a data store like Elasticsearch or Redis Search. This will allow for more intelligent responses using full text and faceted searches, as I mentioned earlier. Another alternative would be to use Alexa and leave behind the text messaging aspects. So just load them into Alexa and then speak to Alexa like you would normally and have Alexa speaking back, so you don't actually have to type anything in or read anything. So if we look at the social implications of chatbot design, back in the 1980s, women learnt things from their friends, siblings, or magazines because we didn't have the internet then. But nowadays, instant messaging is how people communicate with friends, family, and service providers. Most people are more likely to pick up the phone to text someone than they are to make a telephone call or write someone a letter or even write them an email. People engage in deeply personal conversations with these entities, especially teenagers looking to discover things about life without having to ask someone. So a chatbot looked like a good way of giving today's young women a familiar modern portal to access this deeply personal and sensitive material from 30 years ago. There are platforms available for building conversational interfaces, and they are mostly controlled by the big tech companies. These are often free to use for developers, but that comes at the cost of allowing the platform provider to see and analyse each interaction to train its own artificial intelligence. In the workshops, I facilitated a discussion about the trade-offs involved here. We decided to build chatbots both with and without the big conversational interfaces so that we could explore these issues through code. When the original participants agreed to give these interviews, they had no way of knowing and therefore no way of being able to consent to their innermost thoughts being used in this way several decades later. The Reanimating Data project has worked with original consents for publication and reviewed takedown requests for participants, authors or contributors. It's also subject to ethical review and has been approved by the research ethics committees at both the University of Sussex and the University of Edinburgh. So I'm going to finish with some words from Mildred Blackster, who led the original RAP project, and I really love the fact that she's got a cup of tea on there. I think we all need a good cup of tea while we're working with this stuff. And Mildred said the RAP project was an example of really brilliant qualitative work. It was dreadful that it had to be AIDS that it was about, but all that money would never have come into it if it hadn't been AIDS, and if AIDS hadn't been the social problem at the top of the agenda. My name's Suze Shardlow. I am a software engineer, tech event MC, coding instructor, and chapter leader of Ladies of Code London in the UK. I really hope that I've given you something to think about today. You can find me at suze.dev or at Suze Shardlow on Twitter, and you can find the code for the chatbot that you can have a look at and play with at suze.dev/pycon. If you'd like to just play with the bot on the remote server, then go to rap-bot.herokuapp.com. Thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of the conference.